Order of worship for a Christian funeral.
There are no specific rules on how a Christian funeral ought to proceed. Unlike weddings, there's no specific or binding vows that are taken in a funeral. So it's customary that pastors will do funerals for just about anybody. For that reason, a Christian minister doesn't need to be particular about who he does a funeral for. In fact, you don't even have to be an ordained minister to do a funeral. But neither is it true that only ordained ministers can perform funerals. Anybody can perform a funeral legitimately. However, the way we do funerals can point people to Christ, which is what we want. Funerals give us an opportunity to speak to a group of people who don't normally come to church. And it gives us an opportunity to minister to people who otherwise we may not ever be able to. So there are some guidelines that we need to keep in mind that keep Christ first in funerals.
First, do not perform a funeral at a church or promise to do a funeral at a church without contacting the pastor of the church and seeking his permission. This is not only good etiquette, it's good wisdom. A funeral is one of the places where a pastor binds to his flock. By doing funeral, a pastor connects with his congregation. When we do not acknowledge the authority of a local pastor, we may be unwittingly undermining his status with the flock and encouraging them to see other people as their shepherds. It is insulting to a pastor to come into a church for any reason to do anything without seeking his or her permission. In most churches, the church board must also approve an activity within the church, even funerals. Make sure that you have their permission before proceeding, even with the planning for a funeral service. Meet with the family. In planning the funeral, you will need to find out several things from the family. What are the plans for the funeral? Will the casket be present? Will there be a graveside? Will it be conducted in a church sanctuary or in the funeral home? Will there be music or testimonies involved in the service? Will there be any civic organizations involved? Now, these decisions are up to the family, not the pastor. Will there be other pastors in the service? Often a family will want more than one pastor or speaker in the service, and it's necessary to find out who they are and who they want to plan it. At some funerals, pastors get confused when they discover that there are two pastors that have planned the same funeral. What are some personal stories about the deceased? Try to find out as much as you can about what they want to remember about him. You may think you know them, but the family will know them more. Their conversation helps them also because it encourages the family to look beyond the death of the person to the life that they had lived. Remember also to pray with the family. When the family arrives at the funeral home, the pastor should be waiting for them. Prior to the service, the pastor takes the family aside and has a prayer with them on their behalf that God and the deceased will be honored. During this time, the pastor should be looking for people in the family who are particularly distraught. These may need special attention later. Remember, you represent Jesus to the family. The primary job of a pastor at a funeral is to represent Jesus to the mourners. At a funeral, we have a priestly function to represent our words and demeanor in the presence of Christ. We do not just preach Christ at the funeral. In their minds, we represent him, and all that we do needs to be honoring to him. One way a pastor does this is by keeping himself between the mourners and the casket. When they enter the sanctuary, he leads the way. When they lead, he leads. His car is the first one in the funeral procession behind the hearse, and he leads the casket to the graveside. This means that whenever they see the casket, they will see the pastor, reminding them of God's comfort and care. This is not the job we get because of our great personalities. It's simply the function that we must fulfill as office of pastor, as God's representative. It is our duty at funerals to stand in physically for the invisible Jesus. Use lots of scripture. In my funerals, I read scripture more than I preach. I remind the congregation that my words will probably not be remembered, but God's words are powerful. It's a good idea to prepare ahead of time at least a dozen or so passages from the Old Testament and about the same number from the New Testament that are appropriate for funerals, and have them ready to use. I've memorized many of these passages and recite them from memory at funerals. You should also know the difference between a eulogy and a homily. A eulogy means good words about the deceased. Everyone deserves to be remembered at a funeral service for who they were, so every funeral should include some telling of the good qualities of the deceased. A homily is the preaching of the word, and that may be done separately from the eulogy. If you did not know the deceased, or if he or she, there are some things that you can do to help with the eulogy. One is to get somebody else to do a eulogy, and you focus on doing the homily. In other words, have somebody else talk about the deceased and you talk about the gospel. A second thing you can do is to open the floor for anyone in the congregation to share about the deceased. This gives people a chance who come to share things, and oftentimes you find out things about the deceased that you nor even the family did not know. Another thing you can do is to read a letter from somebody in the family about them. Another thing you can do is read from the deceased own writings. If they have a Bible that's well marked up, you can remember some of those scripture passages. If they have articles they've written or something like that, they can be used at a funeral as well. Let's say a few words about graveside services. Usually there'll be a service at a funeral home or a church, and then afterwards there will be a graveside service, though sometimes I've seen it done the other way. Graveside services are, generally speaking, very short. The pastor will usually have a prayer, and then he'll say a few words, not as long as a homily, but just a few words. And then they will do a committal. The committal is where you commit the body to the ground. It usually goes something like this. And now we commit the deceased name to the ground, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in the sure and certain hope of the resurrection to come. In doing this, we focus on the resurrection at the graveside, not at the death. It's helpful for people to remember that there is a hope for eternity and that the grave is not all there is. We need to focus upon their attention upon the resurrection and the temporariness of death, not its permanence. Let's also say a few words about civic rituals. Many organizations, such as lodges or veterans organizations, firemen, policemen, military, etc., have their own rituals that are done at the members' funerals. Most of them are happy to do whatever the pastor wants them to do in accordance with the pastor's wishes. The people that do this are usually very comfortable working with ministers and will get out of their way. However, it is important to focus that let them do their rituals, but only after the pastor has finished his work. The pastor's work is primary in these situations. If there are any concerns about this, discuss it with the person in charge well in advance of the funeral so things can be straightened out at the funeral. After the funeral. For a pastor, the work of comforting the sick, of comforting the bereaved, only begins at the funeral. It continues on for some time afterwards. The hardest time for those who are grieving is often not at the funeral, but 2 or 3 weeks after it. It is then that the full force of the pain hits them. Be sure to follow up with a visit to the principal mourners during this time, and for a long time afterwards to continue to support them. There are particular days when it's important to remember and support those that are mourning. One of those is anniversaries and funerals, as well as the birthdays of those that are deceased. These are times when people need special care, and it's a good idea to keep a record of these. Send cards or text messages to let them know that you care. Studies have shown that at the death of a spouse, the normal healing time is between 2 and 3 years. For people who've gone through a great trauma, it can be 4 or 5 years. And for those that have sudden or wrongful death, it can be 4 or 5 years, and the death of a child may never fully heal. You may need to do that for many years afterwards. Have days of remembrance of the dead in your church, especially around holidays. This gives an opportunity for people to remember those deceased and to continue to heal from their loss.
Whatever you do in a funeral, keep Christ at the center of it. Remember, it's not what you say that's important. It's what God says and what they hear from Him. You simply stand in for God at a funeral. But God is the one that brings all comfort and strength and healing to those who mourn.